So to kick this conversation off, I want to hand it over to Brian. What are your thoughts on the ROI of going serverless?
So the return on your investment is probably developer velocity at the end of the day. But it's also 100% utilization, which is a very opaque term. And so when you're deploying on premises or to the cloud and you're load balancing a monolith, you want to deploy that to at least 3 availability zones so that you have some degree of fault tolerance. If there's a problem, you want to be available, which is a nice way of saying you leave servers running that aren't meeting any demand. And that's inefficient. You have overused capacity just in case there's a spiky event. I worked at Adobe for a little while in Creative Cloud, and we were over provisioning for billions and millions of dollars worth of servers. And we did that because you don't want to be the guy that brought down Creative Cloud. And you want to be available in case any big traffic spikes come. Serverless flips that on its head. Now we're at 100% utilization. You only pay for what you use and you pay by the millisecond. And if you go all in with the cloud, this is really nice because your costs are going to drop very low. Economics of just pure spend on compute. Now, that's nice for your your wallet, but the developers are going to be happier too. They're going to gain a lot of determinism, and through that determinism, they're going to get a lot of reproducibility, which is a nice way of saying when they have a bug, they're going to be able to fix it really quickly. Right now, if I have a bug in my monolith and it's deployed to a cluster of 50 servers, well, where's the bug? I don't know. I'm going to have to grep around in that giant monolith. If I have a bug in my post-contact form Lambda function, and it's erroring more than normal, I know exactly where that code is, and I know exactly how to fix it, how to reproduce it locally, and then deploy it. That's really nice because that means I get to go home at 5. And when I'm on my weekend gardening and doing my stuff with my family, I'm not sitting there thinking, geez, I hope that cluster is still running. I don't want it running. It should only run when someone requests my code. And so 100% utilization is really nice for your wallet, but it's also nice for your developers because they know what they're building is going to keep running when they're not hanging out at work.
Fantastic. And handing it over to Emrah, what are your thoughts on the ROI of going serverless?
Yeah, no, while deciding for going serverless, so we always see greenfield projects that hey, we have this new project, let's make it in serverless, so it will be great to it will be easier, maybe more cost efficient. So it is easier to say, it is easier to decide for greenfield projects, and people can understand the ROI of the this type of projects, but and Brian already made great points about it, but I also want to mention about the brownfield or migration projects. So these are the projects that were the most, how can I say, opposition coming from inside of the company, or maybe sometimes the outside of the company. Why do you want to even just migrate an application that's running peacefully to serverless? You shouldn't do this. So, and there might be very cases that is actually true, but for such projects, such products, so it's still worth migrating to serverless, and very much worth, because as Brian says, that it gives you the ability to resolve the issues a lot faster, and it also gives you use a more modern technologies that helps you, that actually should motivate your engineers inside to use this, because no one wants to deal with the technologies of the 15 years before, and this actually kinds of create a job motivation for anyone, for transferring this information to themselves, and in such cases, you are creating a more resilient, ultimately scalable application, and this is actually creating less cost, happier developers, and at the end of the day, happier customers, because you have more resilient applications, and that totally pays the the effort that you are putting on the table for migrating the applications as well.
Awesome. And I'm going to hand it over to Jeremey. What do you think about the ROI of going serverless?
Well, I mean, one thing that we probably don't like to talk about, but we really do need to talk about, is that serverless is incredibly expensive in terms of the actual cost of running something serverlessly. So if you look at SQS queues, if you get a couple hundred Lambda functions pulling SQS queues, that gets pricey. If you have, CloudFront invalidations, that gets pricey. Data transfer is, just a general problem, that gets pricey. But there are, CloudWatch metrics. 30 cents for a metric for every dimension. That adds up very, very quickly if you're trying to track things across a number of different metrics. So things get expensive when you are running serverless infrastructure. But as Brian said, it's this idea of 100% utilization. So you really have to look at it in terms of saying, well, if I invest in putting all this time and energy into building this serverless application, and I'm going to rely on EventBridge, and I'm going to rely on SQS and Lambda functions and API gateway, then I'm paying, if I'm using regular REST API gateway, I'm paying $3.50 for every million API requests. I've got the Lambda functions running in the background. Maybe I need a little bit of extra temp space. Well, guess what? Now they're going to charge you a little more if you want to run temp space. Like maybe you do have some requirements for provision concurrency, not so much to keep things warm, but because you just need to make sure that you can scale a fleet maybe when you have a larger expected traffic bump coming in. So these things get very, very expensive. And if you just look at it next to, I can run 3 T2 micros. If you look at it next to that, then yeah, it's insanely expensive. But you have to look at it not only from, again, I think Brian, you mentioned this, the idea of the developer productivity, the amount of time that you're going to save from the developers, but also just again, Emrah mentioned the developer happiness metric, which I think is probably the highest metric we need right now, given the fact that pretty much any developer can go anywhere they want to right now and probably make twice as much as they're making right now. So I mean, it is a developer's market, and keeping people happy and sane, I think, is hugely important. And I know for me, and again, I think this is a universal rule. If it takes you, if it used to take you 8 hours to do something, and you could do that, and now you can do it in 4 hours, you're going to find more things to do in that other 4 hours, right? So you're just going to do more, right? So you might not, it's not like you need less people that you can say like, we're going to fire half of our developers because we can do everything in half the time now, or we can do everything in a quarter of the time. We're going to be able to do more, right? And not only that, like maybe it reduces our dev or our ops, right? So our DevOps drops down a little bit. So now we can do more interesting things with DevOps. We can add more automation. We can, again, make developers more happy. So I think that's the trade-off that you have to think about, is to say, there's the huge return on investment. I don't know if it's going to be like, cut the number of developers, because we don't want to do that, right? But being able to build more or build more better. And as I was saying, sort of the way that I think about it is when I'm building serverless applications, I probably spend 75 to 80% of my time thinking about it, and then 20-25% of the time actually writing code or implementing it. And part of the reason for that is because of the complexity of serverless applications and all the things that have to be done, and what are the boxes that need to be ticked and so forth. So again, as we get more advanced with IAC, as we move more towards use cases and things like that, I think the ROI eventually is going to absolutely skyrocket, because then it's going to be, I just need to build a webhook, and you type 2 lines of code, whatever it is you want to process, and then that's deployed, and it moves through some sort of deployment pipeline or whatever it is, and it's just up there, it's running. You don't have to worry about it. And even if it costs a little bit more to run it, the ability to do that and not have to worry about, again, getting up on the weekend or interrupting gardening on the weekends or whatever, that is a huge benefit. Ben Kehoe mentions this all the time. Christmas morning, hey, no alarms went off, right? Even though tons of people are opening their Roombas. That's a pretty powerful reason. That's a pretty good return on investment, even if it's not totally in the form of, cash or cash savings.
Fantastic. I also, when you said you said a part around, it's not going to eliminate jobs. I just wanted to give like a funny story, funny for probably everyone in the audience, less funny for me. I did one of my first big talks was at New Relic's office in downtown Portland, Oregon, and it was the DevOps day, not DevOps day, but DevOps event. And so I got introduced, and they're like, Ryan's going to be telling us about serverless and not about how it's going to kill all of our jobs. And I was like, oh my gosh. And so, yeah, kind of just like a funny moment where it was like, no, it's not going to in your job. It just basically is taking the domain knowledge and all the skills you have currently, and then just making you more efficient and do less like mundane repeated tasks and spend more times on things that actually are like really enjoyable. And so on that topic, let me go ahead and switch it over to Thorsten. Thorsten, what do you think about the ROI of going serverless?
Yes, so I see a lot of customers thinking about serverless for the first time with very low loads. So it's not about the big pricey things, but so what's the cheapest option to run a server or run an API endpoint that's not serverless? It's a load balancer. It's at least 2 containers or servers or whatever. So you start with about $30 or $40. It's not much, but with serverless, you can do it for the free tier or $1. And if you multiply this by a lot, like you're having microservices and having 100 services in this category, and you need them once a day, then that's where customers start thinking about serverless to get their cost down to zero during testing. Every developer could have their own development environment. I don't care if I have 100 Lambda functions running around. They don't do anything. So do it. Try getting every developer their own environment using Fargate or using servers. Nobody's going to pay for this. And so that's
Beanstalk.
Yeah, Beanstalk. So that's where you get this return of investment for being cheaper on all your development environments you do not use all the time or at all. So that's one of the big things, and it's back to developer happiness and speed. So if I think about, so having one example, deploying new code. If you deploy new code, despite CloudFormation being slow, if you do CDK deploy, it synthesizes your Lambda function, it uploads it to S3. If you use CDK Watch or Hotswap, it will bypass CloudFormation and just do a function code update. But the next request coming in will hit your new code. Try doing this with containers or VMs. It's packaging, uploading somewhere. Yeah, so it takes a lot longer. So in the section before, we were discussing like it's taking minutes or seconds if it's before it's live in CloudFormation. Yes, but if you deploy to a server or a container, it takes minutes or hours. So, and that's the speed of getting my change into some environment where I can test it. Basically, with CDK Watch, it's hitting save, waiting for 2 seconds, the next request hits your new code. And that's where speed comes in and feedback comes in. And that's, I can think of something, build it, try it out, and it's done. Instead of deploying it, forgetting about it, grabbing coffee, doing something else, and then coming back, oh yeah, there was something going on. So that's where the investment or the return of investment comes in, that features hit the road faster. So I get my features done because I don't wait for them and forget about them during their deploy.
Thorsten really loves that CDK thing. I have a feeling like he wrote a book about it or something.
Maybe I wrote a book about it.
Oh my gosh. All right. So going to the next person. Gary, what are your thoughts on the ROI of going serverless?
I think for me, the biggest one would be developer velocity, like has been mentioned before. And, I think just in my own experience and how it's affected me, when I started in web development, the teams I was a part of, it was usually like front-end people, back-end people, and then ops. And it was very strong silos, big walls between those groups of people. And you need like a manager to mediate between them. There just was no sort of awareness of what it was like to be a part of those other groups. And often when you're developing features, there'd be miscommunication between those groups. And it was rough. But when I started doing serverless development, and you immediately become a full stack, at least that's been my experience, because you have to think about everything, right? You have to think about your infrastructure first. And the impact it's had on me in my own development or velocity is, as a front-end developer, back-end developer, whatever, I tend to think in terms of resources. So if I'm making a front-end application, I'm thinking about S3, I'm thinking about CloudWatch. How am I going to how am I going to visualize or monitor this thing? And that's just the level that I think at. And that's been, for me, that's been really good for my velocity. It's been good for my teammates' velocities as well. I've been at companies where we just hire just developers. We don't specify front end, back end, or ops. It's just you're a serverless developer who works with a full stack, and that's all there is to it. So I think that's one outcome of being what serverless does for a team is it can potentially change the way your team is structured, and it could potentially get rid of those silos. But I'm interested to know, Jeremey, what your thoughts are on this, because, when I think about code as infrastructure, where it's like you define your business logic and infrastructure is derived out of that. You don't really think about the underlying infrastructure. That's a different angle. And I'm wondering, how do you see serverless cloud and how that changes the way people think about serverless infrastructure or the way that teams are structured and so on?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we tried to do is we call it infrastructure from code as opposed to infrastructure as code. But essentially, we defined an SDK that you have access to. So you say API.get, just like you would in Express or whatever. And then we can process that when we load that file, and we can look at it and say, okay, you want an API and you want a get route. And so we can generate whatever infrastructure you need in order to support that. And the reason why we're doing that, again, whether it's for schedules or events or whatever, is because it doesn't matter if we deploy to a Lambda function or to a Fargate container or to a VM somewhere or to somebody's Raspberry Pi in their garage. It really doesn't matter. It shouldn't matter so much to you. I mean, I'd care about the Raspberry Pi thing, but essentially we can deploy whatever infrastructure makes sense for your service to run how it needs to run, and it can be optimized over time. So we could start by saying, look, it makes a lot of sense just to spin up that Lambda function with an API gateway because, as Thorsten said, we don't want to pay for it in development or whatever. But if that starts getting hit over and over and over and over again, we're like, well, you know what? It might make sense to actually spin this up on Kubernetes with EKS and have that running in the background and just route those requests to that instead because it's a high velocity or a high throughput container or whatever it is. So that's what we're trying to do is basically abstract away the idea of the primitives. Same thing with events. Like with events right now, we have an eventing system that runs on SQS and DynamoDB. Part of the reason why we use those and not EventBridge is because of some of the delaying techniques we have and some of the other things we have where you can look up stuff and whatever. But that doesn't mean that we can't change it tomorrow to EventBridge to support more things. You never have to change your code. You just said event.publish or event.on, right? And it's able to read that stuff. So we look at this as maybe we went a little too extreme, right? Where we went beyond the use case thing and went straight to just write your business logic and let us interpret it. But we're pretty, it's pretty solid in terms of how it does it. And I know that, again, I'm huge on deterministic deployments as well. Like whatever you write, it should be the same thing every single time. And so that's, and this does this as well, right? So it's not like you just, are writing any script you want to, and then it magically uses AI and whatever to figure out what it is that you're trying to do. You're very explicit. You're saying, I want to publish an event. I want to listen to an event. I want to write something to the data store. I want to, run an event, or I want to run a, HTTP endpoint on this post or get or whatever it is. So you're very explicit about that. And as long as those things are explicit, we generate a manifest file technically. So we know exactly what you need based off of when we read that in. So we'll add things in the future. We'll do drift protection and some of those other things. But I think it's a pretty solid way to kind of address it and not have to let people focus on saying, I'm writing an API handler, and then I have to go define that as infrastructure as code somewhere, and then I have to do another step where I have to go ahead and deploy that, make sure everything's zipped and all the code matches up and all my builds are, mapped to things, and I got to worry about, maybe I got to use some sort of, I can't even think of the right term for it, but I've got to make sure that I can map everything. I'm using sort of cloud mapping or whatever. Like, it's crazy to have to do all those things. So if I can just say, I want an API, I want to deploy it, and knowing that it's not being deployed to Heroku in some Linux box or whatever that's running somewhere that isn't in multiple regions and all that kind of stuff, we can do all of that just by having this very, very simple syntax, this simple SDK that expresses exactly what you want to do, and then with all of the details kind of managed behind you. And it is a bit of a black box, and we've had that complaint. They're like, well, how do I add an SQS queue? And you're like, well, I mean, you don't, because we don't supply you with that primitive. But here's how you can do what you want to do with the services that we provide to you.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because it's like there's two philosophies. It's like, do you make the underlying resources clear or do you blur it? And I don't know that there's right or wrong. I think it's just there's different reasons why you would want one or the other.
Right.
I think that's it. I think it's a use case and trade-offs and personal tastes and all those things. This did kick off another ROI thing that I wanted to throw out there before we moved on. That's security.
Yes.
So I don't know why I always forget this one. So security and compliance, pretty big deal. Probably want to lock your stuff down. Infrastructure as code is a really great way to do that. And you can get very, very explicit. You can say this user can only access this row and these attributes in this Dynamo table if you want to be that least privilege about things. So I just wanted to huck that one over the fence into the ether that, oh, by the way, it's also secure.
Yeah, well, and you know what? The other thing that's important about that too, Brian, is the fact that when you're using something declarative, that and this is where I really like the idea of sort of that a very declarative syntax, some sort of DSL that really shows you exactly what's happening, and there's not a lot of interpretation. You don't have for loops in there and some other things that are happening in the CDK. Is that can go through a code review process, right? So you can review that and say, okay, wait, hold on a second, we don't want to do this, or we don't want to have a database that gets in there that doesn't have a good retain policy or whatever that is. You can do that at that level. You can still do it with the CDK. It's just, again, I feel like the CDK is another bit of an abstraction. And again, not because I really like what the CDK does, and I just have a couple of small concerns about things like that. But I think that if you take code through a review process, now you're reviewing your infrastructure before that even gets to that next step. And if you have a good process for that, then again, that not only adds security and compliance and all those other things, but does give you that extra set of eyes, that you can look at it before it gets, potentially does some damage to your live infrastructure.
Can be even automated. Like,
yes.
There's no way this app is allowed to access this stuff or can only access these other stuff. And that's actually quite nice. And we've been using Deno lately a bunch, and it's got some nice security aspects to it. But I don't need any of those things because is my security layer. Like Deno, you can tell it to not read the file system. What do I care if it reads the file system of temp inside of a Lambda function that's about to go away? Go for it. Have fun.
That's exactly another ROI factor of going serverless. It's not only about infrastructure as code for security, but it's also serverless for security. Yeah, building code is one thing, but then run it on EC2, run it on containers. You need to think of, where does this container come from? Is it patched? Is all the antivirus machine software setup done? Is there any proxies? Or you have jump through a lot of hoops to do a compliant EC2 setup. If you have some regulator in-house and everything you have is serverless, is here's artifact. Look at what Amazon is doing. I don't care. It's compliant. And that saves money too, because it saves money to build these things or to not build these things, and it saves money by you won't make the front page with any unexpected things.
I mean, in the isolation model in and of itself too is huge. I mean, I remember building a startup back in 2010, I think it was. First thing I was building on AWS, and we had an idea of app servers, and then we had database servers, and we had image servers, and we basically had to create all these different clusters. Like we were building microservices back then, probably before we even knew we were doing that. But essentially dedicated servers that did a certain type of job. And of course, with our app servers, though, everything ran on the app server. So the app had full access to the database. You could delete rows, you could add rows, you could update rows or whatever. But with serverless, it's really interesting because if you have image processing lambdas, well, you can spin up 10,000 of those or one of those, right? And that can scale independently, and that has no access to the database or only has the ability to post information to one particular table in the database. And then you have other ones that can do stuff. So the services that are more destructive, right? Maybe you can put more time and energy into those and make sure that you're doing that extra layer of protection there. Whereas the other ones, you just say, well, it really can't do anything destructive. So we still want it to be secure, but at the same time, that risk, that bulkhead, that now the blast radius is so much smaller because you've really minimized what it does. And again, and then you don't have to scale hundreds of servers in order to do all these different things. Instead, you can just run independent Lambda functions that do it independently.
Yeah, and I wanted to add as well. I helped work as an architect as well as had different people from Serverless Guru as well, of course. And we were helping on an enterprise PCI project. And what was so interesting about this, because the entire thing that we were building was serverless.
It was interesting, really? No, just kidding.
It was stressful. I'll say that. It's super stressful. The interesting part came later, of course, when you look back and you're like, oh, we made it over the hill. Now we can celebrate a little bit. But when they started handing us, questionnaires with 500 questions, of course, that's very not fun. The interesting part was none of them were relevant really. The serverless takes care of so many things for this specific PCI project. It was the first time the actual senior PCI consultant was seeing just the power of serverless in terms of just not having as many boundaries. We weren't managing the load balancers. We didn't have physical servers that we were having to SSH into. All those were requirements that were in that document, and they weren't relevant to what we were doing. And as Brian was saying, IAM was kind of the holy grail there. And then we just basically separated by environment. We had the CloudTrail flowing to an audit account, and then the entire infrastructure was API gateways and Lambdas and SQS and so on. So that was a super cool project to see. I don't know how much how widely it is talked about, that at least in terms of if you're doing something like PCI related, serverless can really jumpstart, especially for a large company where they then have to go through a gigantic PCI audit. And that can require, I think we had a team of 15 people or something crazy like that were all thinking about this. We ended up doing a lot of the development just because it was, we didn't need people to spin up the virtual machines to then make that protective. We were just writing the application code and making sure that stuff was secure. So, yeah.
I think a lot of the effort there is trying to explain why half these questions don't matter. They're like, what? Why?
Yes.
Do you know what you're doing? Do you know what you're building? They're like, yeah, we do. It's just, we need to explain it.
Well, the other thing I was going to say is I think the last PCI audit I did was 2018, and there were no questions about the cloud on there. And it was who has access to your data center? I'm like, I have no idea. The snowball truck, maybe. I'm not sure, but it's not me or anybody that I know. And I think that's one thing that AWS has actually done really well is gotten the compliance, the PCI, and all that other stuff for their different services. And that's easier now to pass through. As long as you're following the practices you need to follow, then their services underlying what you're building already are compliant with those things. So still sort of a pain, but I did a security audit not too long ago, and it's still the questions, not even related to PCI. It was it's 1992, and you still are running a Sun Microsystems data center on site. It's crazy.
I will say one more thing on this topic. Security didn't go away, and it's not solved. It's totally different beast now, and the things that you have to worry about are actually really weird. So we didn't set up WAF properly on begin, and we got DDoSed, and we didn't notice because our stuff's serverless and it just scaled up. Right? It was great, and it was great until I noticed, and I was like, "Oh no, my wallet!" And but we set up WAF and blocked Turkmenistan, and everything was fine. But it's different, right? I never had a, "Oh no, this thing is scaling up too much" problem. I was I used to have the opposite problem. How do we keep this thing running? Now it's "Oh no, how do we shut it off?" So there's just a new set of concerns that are completely different for security, but it is just, it's a lot nicer. I hated patching servers. That was horrible.
Yeah, to touch on that, I worked on I was on this tech ops team towards the beginning of my career, where it was operations. I had been doing serverless and I got kind of added into it. And it was interesting because I was like applying that to this. And then it was like, we have 300 black box EC2 servers and we've got to like turn them down and so on. And it was right around, I think it was Spectre meltdown, like the meltdown hack that happened. And of course those weren't patching, but the AWS side for serverless, like it patched underneath. And so there was like this whole thing of like, I don't even remember what the automation tools we were using were, and I had to write stuff for, but it was just this huge process of, we need to like SSH into hundreds of servers. And then we have to like write down that we upgraded it properly and patched it properly. And that was just a whole mess. And it required so many people and so much like oversight and all that stuff. And the whole time you're like looking over the fence and you're like, oh, but it's already done over here though. Like, what are we doing? You know? Yeah.